Hello, today we're here with poet Kristina Marie Darling, and she's going to read her poem for Sign and Breath, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome, Kristina.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm just going to go ahead and start with the poem. So this is called Sad Film with Subtitles. The first scene was nearly untranslatable. Velocity and the little ache at the very back of the throat. Were we seeing a design in the narrative when all that was really there was a hand on the waist, the movement of a white dress in the middle distance? And for once they traveled to a country that spoke another language entirely, without so much as a miniature dictionary to lessen the shock. To lose that thread the moment the wind picks up, to no longer be able to trace the progress of an idea or the line that reason makes in the hot white sand, was to somehow always be on holiday. Still, they both had to wonder what the gatekeeper thought of them. Their mouths that empty, not even a cough to break the silence.
Wow, what a mysterious and wonderful little koan of a poem. Tell me about how voice plays a role in your composition of that poem and in general, Kristina.
Yeah, thank you for that great question. So I've been really intrigued by this kind of legacy among poets that frames poetic voice as an alterity that speaks through the poet. So for Homer, this was the muses. For H.D., the great modernist poet, this was the unconscious mind speaking through the writer. And for Jack Spicer, it was radio waves from outer space that spoke through the poet. And more recently, in modern, contemporary experimental texts, we have collaboration as a kind of alterity or otherness that speaks through the poet. And with me writing this poem in particular, it's my reading life and my life as a kind of scholar that speaks through the poem. I mean, when I was working on this particular text, I was steeped in Lynn Haginian, Joshua Clover, and all of those other great postmodern writers. And I think of the poem as kind of a synthesis of these influences. Every poem is really a deconstruction of and kind of scholarly take on everything that came before.
Wow, what a wonderful way to connect all of these poetic traditions all the way back to Homer. Our attempt somehow to mediate. It's a wonderful way of looking at it, and especially I think in this poem, because it begins by saying the first scene was nearly untranslatable, which I think in a sense expresses something of that terrible difficulty that we have with making poems. And you make poems in so many different modes. And I guess what I'm wondering is, how did those modes, is there a unifying theme or motif, or does every poem demand its own form for you? Tell us a little about the proliferation of forms and scholarship, I might add, that you engage in.
Yeah, thank you so much for this thoughtful question. So in general, my work traverses a wide range of forms and genres, but the one kind of common thread that ties everything together is this kind of impulse to defamiliarize. And I think that where that comes from is my incredible love of travel. So when I was doing my PhD at SUNY Buffalo, I passed my qualifying exam and went long distance for my PhD thesis. And I just used that time to go to residencies, to write grants, and just travel the world and meet other writers and scholars and artists. And the poet Eva Heisler says it best, that to travel is to experience oneself as foreign. And I think that that kind of defamiliarization of the self comes through in all of the ways that my poetry and my writing makes things strange. Even the most familiar, ordinary things, I love to render them suddenly and startlingly unfamiliar in my poetry.
Mm, wow. And of course, I follow your travels enviously on Facebook, Kristina. And yes, you were all over the world and wonderful in different settings. Um, and of course, as you say, in all of those settings, you experience yourself as foreign. I'm wondering how the poem is in a sense a foreign object composed in this technology we call the alphabet. How when that poem then re-enters your body and is expressed orally, how does that mode differ for you from the way it looks on the page and the way you experience it alphabetically?
Yeah, the question of, the visual presentation of the work is a really excellent one, because I think poems are visual even when we don't realize it. And what really intrigues me is the many preconceived notions that readers bring to prose. And with this particular prose poem, I really enjoyed capitalizing on those preconceived expectations, being aware of them and using them as a writerly material. So in general, most readers will see a prose paragraph and they will expect the language to unfold in a particular way. They'll expect it to be linear, logical. They'll expect a certain consistency in terms of the textures of language that they're presented with. And those preconceived ideas or expectations are just an opportunity to give the reader something that they really don't expect, a moment of beauty and emotional truth where they never expected to find it. And I think that that experience of giving the reader the unexpected, subverting their expectations, is also a powerful way to get at, certain emotional truths that you couldn't get at otherwise.
Wow. And of course, in this poem in particular, not only do you have the interface between the expectations created by prose and the subversion of those expectations through the poetic techniques, but then you bring in film as well, another genre. Tell us about, I mean, you've already spoken a little bit about the way tradition is the muse for you. I mean, tradition and reading is the muse. What about your other experiences of art forms, which also play a large role in your opus, in your work?
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about film and its relationship to poetry, because that is something that I never really get to talk about. So I'm really excited by this question. And with my work as an editor, I'm the editor-in-chief of Tupelo Press and Tupelo Quarterly. And the first thing I did when I became editor-in-chief of Tupelo Quarterly was start a special section of the magazine, which was collaborative and cross-disciplinary texts. And what this section is within the magazine is poetry films, cinepoetry, video poems, collaborations between writers and visual artists, sound poems. We had some really incredible sound poems from Kate Greenstreet in a past issue. So I hope you will check them out. But in general, what intrigues me so much about film and its relationship to poetry is that poets tend to envision pacing in a very boring way, I hate to say, but filmmakers use time in the most intriguing ways, and they use silence to give the audience or give the spectator an experience of time, to create suspense. And that is something that I wanted to steal for my own work as a poet, to use silence, to use white space and time as units of composition in my poem. And when you see the poem in the anthology, there's a big gap right in the middle. And that's that's part of what I'm talking about, this use of silence to, make the reader wait a second, to keep them in suspense, to generate anticipation and heighten, hopefully, the effects of the narrative that I'm crafting.
Kristina Marie Darling, thank you so much for joining us on Sign and Breath.
Thank you so much for the lovely conversation, and I look forward to seeing the anthology in print.